Alright, so we'll just pull over.
Okay.
You know, if we could get better public transportation and have it cross town, those areas to develop like neighborhoods.
Yeah.
Okay, so my name's Chris Cantwell. I teach history and religious studies at the University of Missouri, Kansas City, as Wesley said earlier. Just to give a brief overview, so we're going to be making 6 stops on the 30-mile route. So we'll stop out every 5, 6, 7 miles, kind of depending on where we're at. And for those of you who don't know, this is the second year of this tour, or the ride. And the first year was sort of like, it's called the Cathedral Gran Fondo. And it was like, let's drive by churches and see, and just look at them. And so then Ben and I met last year. I moved here actually right when that first one happened, and I said, well, I teach religious history, so we can actually tell a story through the churches that we see. And so that's what I want to do today, is we'll be telling sort of Kansas City's history through the history of its religious institutions. And this is our first stop here, which is actually, I think, one of the most phenomenal buildings. It's old, obviously. This is 7th Street Methodist Church, which actually began as a congregation of the Wyandotte Indians, from which Wyandotte County gets its name. But, you know, as Mike Caldwell was talking about earlier, when Lewis and Clark came here, they met the Kaw Indians, right? This was actually Kaw territory. The Wyandotte Indians had moved here from Ohio. And they had actually not even from Ohio, they had moved here from upstate New York. The Wyandotte Indians actually called themselves the Wendat. And when the French first encountered them in the 1600s, they began calling them the Huron, which in French means sort of ruffian or pig's head. So they sort of called these, there was an unnatural name, they sort of named these folks. The name sort of sticks, obviously, we have Huron around. But a contingent of the Wendat Indians moved to Ohio to sort of flee the conflict between French and British imperial rule. And the Wyandotte Indians, what they sort of saw as like the best way to preserve Native American culture and heritage was actually to adapt and sort of accommodate themselves to the largest British culture so they could hold on to what mattered to them of Native American culture. So in Ohio, they built very Anglo-looking towns. They had mayors, they had private property, and so they organized themselves so they just sort of in the hopes that once white settlers came to Ohio, they wouldn't kick them off. But of course, in 1833, when sort of westward expansion happens, white settlers come and the land is seized by the federal government of Ohio. They sold over, actually I should get the numbers right, sold over 23,000 acres in Ohio for $46,000. That's what they were paid for in 1833. And in exchange, the federal government sold them 100,000 acres of land in this area, which they had just taken from the Kaw. So it was sort of hand after hand after hand. And so in 1843, the Wyandotte Indians came here and established this congregation. And so their model of sort of like adapting to the larger culture, many of them had become Christians, converted by Methodist missionaries in Ohio. And sort of their involvement in sort of trying to be, consider themselves good American citizens as well as Native Americans at the same time. They actually had a fight over slavery in the 1840s, and the congregation split in two. So this is the anti-slavery congregation that hung around. This building was built in the 1880s, and it was built in 1888. And the reason that the only one, so there's no pro-slavery Wyandotte congregation anymore, was because once the Civil War came around, suddenly being pro-slavery in Kansas was somewhat of a problem. So most of the Wyandotte Indians that were around here now moved down to Oklahoma, and that's where the remnant of sort of the tribe is today. There's about 2,000 to 4,000 Wyandotte Indians in Oklahoma and southern Kansas. And then this one sort of remains. But as you can see here, if you look around at the building in general, there's all kinds of different sort of, Iglesia, Tabernaculo, MBC stands for Missionary Baptist Church. And so this building becomes sort of the embodiment of Kansas City's change, right? It's sort of opened as sort of an up-and-coming sort of respectable town. And then as sort of the demographics of the city start to change, Missionary Baptist Church is a black charismatic congregation that was founded in 1955, along with the arrival of large numbers of African Americans from the South after World War II. And so I bring this up for sort of two reasons. And so one, sort of the history of religion, and really the history of Kansas City is a history of movement, right? People going places and moving from not only sort of one part of the country to another, but even just from one neighborhood to the other, and that sort of radically changing the religious landscape. But then also when we talk about religion in urban environments and in general, sort of the modus operandi is adapt and reuse. And as we sort of bike through here, we'll see all kinds of different churches that were at one point sort of white Methodist, Presbyterian, and Catholic churches that have now, the buildings have become completely reused based on the demographics of the area now. And so as we sort of bike to the next location, which will actually be in KC-Mo, you can just sort of see these older buildings that have now been sort of revived and reutilized and reused by the current residents. So, I don't think so, from what we can tell. Yeah, I mean, it's really shuttered and unkempt. But it's also, it's reflective of really the material circumstances of the congregation, right? So they very well could be using this and just not afford to be able to take care of it. But, I mean, as you see here, actually there's another sign on the other side, actually, we found. At one point it was a Kojic church, which is the Church of God in Christ, which is a Black Pentecostal denomination. And so it's turned over 5 or 6 different times in the last 30, 40 years. So yeah, so we'll stop, like I said, we'll stop 6 times. I'll talk for like 5, 10 minutes. Feel free to interrupt me or say I'd like to keep going. I'm just here to do this for fun, so. All right.
Thank you.
No, we're just gonna bike by it. We're gonna bike by a lot of churches.
So is that church that's still active?
It is, but you'll see it's a different congregation. So it was a Catholic church at one. Actually, no, it was a Presbyterian church at one point, and now it's an Asian American evangelical congregation. With that church? Well, this area was once, a completely different kind of neighborhood. This was sort of the residential district of KCK. Because Kansas started as sort of like a streetcar suburb of Kansas City, Missouri. So this was all residential. It didn't really have its own downtown until the 1900s. Yeah. Is that a long trip? Is that what it is? You're right, yeah. I'm actually teaching that book this semester, yeah.
And if you guys need water or some, we have bananas, apples, some water, some chips, and some candy if you need some sugar.
Okay.
Anytime.
So our next slide will be a little longer. This was like not even a
Follow
mile
right
here.
behind you.